All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is my good friend Alice Ollstein. Alice is a reporter for ThinkProgress, which you can find at thinkprogress.org. You can also follow her on Twitter at Alice Ollstein. Alice, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so Alice, most people, I'm pretty sure, have heard of the giant debt crisis that's going on in Greece. Not as many have heard about what's happening in Puerto Rico, which is also unbelievably dire. You covered it for ThinkProgress. Tell us what's happening there.
Yes, I spent almost a week there, and it was absolutely fascinating and devastating, really, what's going on. And the comparisons to Greece are apt because there is these harsh austerity plans being put forward, just like in Greece, that would just completely decimate social spending, suggestions to privatize public buildings, public services, and especially cut education budgets, lay off teachers, close schools. Some of that is already happening. The proposals also are calling for lowering the minimum wage and cutting workers' rights to benefits and vacations, things that they've, fought to earn over time through, organizing struggles. And so talking to workers there is a lot of concern. The comparison to Greece also makes sense because the same hedge funds and the same hedge fund billionaires have their fingers all over both countries. There is a lot of evidence and reports that I include in my reporting that show that these hedge funds pushed Puerto Rico to take on a lot of debt that they couldn't afford under terms that were very favorable to the hedge funds to get back a big profit. And now they can't pay. Now, Puerto Rico is asking the U.S., because it is a commonwealth of the U.S., so it can't independently do some of these things on its own. It doesn't have the rights of a sovereign country, but it doesn't have the rights of a state of the United States either. They're sort of in this limbo where they have very little control over what's happening. So they've asked the U.S. Congress to pass a bill allowing them to declare bankruptcy to be able to restructure some of this unmanageable debt. And Congress right now is on their usual one-month August recess vacation, and they are not acting on that, and they may not. And one of the reasons is that these same hedge funds are lobbying Congress not to allow them to declare bankruptcy because that would cut into their profits.
Well, one of the insidious ways, it's many things that led to this debt, but one of the insidious ways is this something, people call them vulture funds, where you have these hedge funds buy up distressed assets, essentially on pennies on the dollar. They buy up these things that are pretty much worthless, and then they demand payment like immediately. And the way, and so like they can buy things for like pennies on the dollar, and if they get a nickel on the dollar, they're making millions of dollars essentially. And it's really insidious because it's already junk. So they buy junk and then they demand money for the junk that they bought. It's really horrible.
And it's interesting because here in D.C. we have not seen that much about it, but in New York, where there is a very large and very active Puerto Rican immigrant population, well, they're not immigrants, they're U.S. citizens, but they have migrated from Puerto Rico to the U.S. And the community in New York is very active around this and has been holding protests outside of these hedge fund offices. And they will continue to do so. And I think that's something to really pay attention to, whether that has any effect. They're even researching where else those hedge funds are active. They're active in Detroit, Detroit's bankruptcy, restructuring, privatization mess, as well as in Argentina. Argentina refused and has been battling in courts over its debt crisis. So, really, we keep saying the same players over and over and over, but the ones who are really suffering in all of those countries, including in Puerto Rico, are the workers.
Right. Well, not even the workers, but also the poor. I think in the article you mentioned something around like 56% of Puerto Rican children live in poverty.
Yes, and there's sort of a spiral going on, a feedback loop in which, because of the horrible economic situation there, a lot of families are migrating to the mainland U.S., but as the population goes down, they are shuttering schools, which, of course, if you're a child in a small community and your school closes and you have to travel a great distance to go to the nearest school, that could mean that there is no accessible public education for you anymore, and that's been happening.
Yeah, it's so crazy, and again, it's something that's happening obviously in Greece. Just the cycle of austerity, and like literally in history, you have never been able to. There is no instance at all of being able to use austerity to get out of an economic crisis and an economic downturn. Every single solitary time, it makes it worse, and yet we allow these billionaires essentially to keep pushing this solution because they're making money off of the pain of others that really just guts basic society wherever they go.
And I don't want to completely let the Puerto Rican government off the hook here. Sure. They have made really bad decisions over the past, several decades, really, focusing so much on attracting foreign capital and foreigners and neglecting their local economies. There is research and study put out last year that the island has more Walmarts per capita than any state in the United States. And so when people are spending their money there, that money is leaving the island and going to Walmart, whereas if they spent it at a local corner store, that money would stay in the local economy. I talked to a small organic farmer. Agriculture has been completely, disinvested on the island. There's very few people doing farming, especially doing the kind of, small-scale farming for the local community. And he was really frustrated that the government doesn't seem to be supporting people like him who are trying to build this local economy, and instead is focusing on what is grown on the island gets exported, and then they import the vast majority of the food eaten on the island.
Wow, that's wild. What's also, you mentioned it earlier, but it's also sort of crazy, is that Puerto Rico is a commonwealth of the U.S., so they have a congressperson, but they don't actually have a vote in Congress. And I think you wrote that the district actually has technically more U.S. citizens than any other House member does, but yet they actually don't have a vote in the actual House.
Yes. Puerto Rico's sole member of Congress, Pedro Pierluisi, who I interviewed, represents 3.5 million U.S. citizens, and he cannot vote in Congress. So he's introduced bills, like I said, to give the island those bankruptcy protections and rights, and he can't even vote on that bill. So when I went to Puerto Rico, I was, bonding and finding common cause with people by explaining that in the District of Columbia, we similarly don't have representation.
Well, so overall, I mean, you mentioned earlier that Puerto Rico is sort of in the worst case scenario because they don't really have the ability, since they're a commonwealth, they don't actually have the ability to print their own money. They don't have the ability to do much of anything. What is the struggle? Because there's actually kind of two different ideas that are kind of competing in Puerto Rico, right? What are the two different ideas of ways of trying to actually get Puerto Ricans agency?
Well, it's interesting. So I talked to a professor at the University of Puerto Rico, and he was explaining that Puerto Rico's political parties, unlike political parties in a lot of countries, they're not organized by their vision for society or their values or what they believe in, what kind of economy they want to create. They're just divided by the question of status, whether they believe in statehood or in independence or in remaining a commonwealth. And that's really at issue here, and it's coming at a time when the island is now forced to think about what they want to create as a society, and folks were, whatever side they were already on, they sort of see it as an argument for their rights. So the statehood folks who already believed in statehood look at the current crisis and say, well, if we were a state with full states' rights, we would be able to declare bankruptcy and restructure our debt in a more manageable way. The independence folks say, well, if we were an independent nation, we could set our own wages, set our own trade policies. Manufacturing on the island was devastated by NAFTA and CAFTA, neither of which they had any vote in approving or disapproving. Right. And so, again, it's sort of, you can draw whatever interpretation you want, but, and the current governor is pro-remaining a commonwealth, and so we'll have to see next year when they elect a new governor if that's going to change.
Do we have any idea what it would actually take? I mean, could they theoretically, would they be like secession because they're a commonwealth? How would that actually work? I admit I have no idea, what a Commonwealth to leave the country would actually even theoretically look like legally. Is there any type of precedent for something like that when it comes to U.S. territories or commonwealths?
Well, it's interesting because just in the Caribbean region alone, there are so many colonies and former colonies of various powers, and they all have sort of these very different ways of working it out. And the professor was explaining to me that the French sort of commonwealths that are still there, like Martinique, they have essentially full states' rights. France doesn't have states, they have sort of departments, but those islands have, full voice in policies, unlike Puerto Rico does. And so there are so many models they could follow, and there are many models they might not want to follow. But again, it would be sort of uncharted territory, but they have a lot of other countries to learn from.